Smoke filled the sky before the screaming started. Alara Voss was 10 years old, hiding behind a stack of firewood, when the first house at the edge of the village burst into flames. She did not understand what was happening. One moment she had been chasing fireflies with her cousin, and the next, the whole world had turned into noise and fire and running feet. Her mother's hand grabbed her wrist so hard it hurt. "Do not look back," her mother said. Her voice was shaking, but her grip was steady. "Run to the forest. Do not stop for anything." Alara wanted to ask why. She wanted to ask where her father was, and why the sky looked orange instead of black, and why the neighbors were screaming instead of sleeping, but her mother's eyes told her there was no time for questions. There was only time to run. They moved through the narrow paths between the houses, past the well where Alara used to fetch water every morning, past the bakery that always smelled like warm bread. Now the bakery had a hole in its roof, and smoke poured out of it like a wound that would not stop bleeding. Warriors moved through the village like a flood that could not be stopped. They wore armor marked with a crest Alara had never seen before, a silver wolf with its jaws open wide. She did not know the name of the pack that crest belonged to. She only knew that everyone wearing it brought fire and pain wherever they went. Her father met them near the tree line, blood on his sleeve, his eyes wild with fear he was trying to hide for her sake. He was the alpha of their pack, a strong man who had never once looked afraid in Alara's whole life. Seeing fear on his face now frightened her more than the fire did. "They found us," he said to her mother. "The king's men. They know where we are." "Why?" Alara's mother asked, though it seemed less like a question and more like a plea for the world to make sense again. "It does not matter why," her father said. "Get her to the forest. I will hold them as long as I can." Alara's mother pulled her close for one moment, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Listen to me," she whispered. "The forest will protect you if you let it. Find the deep parts, past the twisted oak, past the river that never freezes. Hide there. Do not trust anyone who follows you, no matter what they say. Do you understand?" Alara did not understand. She was 10, but she nodded anyway, because her mother needed her to nod, and because there was fire everywhere, and no time left to be confused. Her father knelt down and looked into her eyes. "You are stronger than you know," he said. "Someday you will understand why this happened, but today, you only need to run. Run, and do not stop, no matter what sounds you hear behind you." Alara wanted to hug him longer. She wanted to ask him to come with her, but her mother was already pulling her toward the trees, and the sound of hooves and shouting was growing louder behind them. The last thing Alara saw of her father was his back, turned toward the warriors in silver armor, standing tall between them and his family. She would carry that image for the rest of her life, sharper than any other memory from that night. Her mother ran beside her through the trees, weaving between trunks that Alara had known her whole life as a playground, and now saw as something else entirely, a maze that might save her, or might swallow her whole. Branches scratched at her arms. Roots tried to trip her feet, but her mother's hand never let go, not until they reached a shallow ravine half a mile into the forest. "Down there," her mother said, pointing to a gap beneath a fallen tree, hollow enough for a small child to squeeze into. "Hide. Do not come out until it is quiet. Do not come out even if you hear my voice calling you, unless I say the word we practiced. Do you remember it?" Alara nodded. The word was sunflower. Her mother had taught it to her months ago as a game, a secret code between just the two of them. She had never imagined it would matter this much. "I have to go back," her mother said. "Your father needs me." "No," Alara said, her voice breaking. "Please, stay with me." Her mother's face crumpled for just a moment, the first crack in her calm since the fire had started. Then she steadied herself, cupped Alara's face in both hands, and said words that Alara would repeat to herself for the next 15 years of her life. "You are the last of us now, if it comes to that. You have to live. Promise me you will live, no matter what it costs." "I promise," Alara whispered. Her mother kissed her forehead one final time, then turned and ran back toward the village, back toward the smoke and the screaming, back toward the man she loved. Alara watched her disappear between the trees, and then she was alone. She crawled into the hollow beneath the fallen tree, pulling leaves and broken branches over the opening, the way her mother had shown her once during a game of hide-and-seek. The space was cold and damp, and it smelled like wet earth and rotting wood. She curled into a ball and pressed her hands over her ears, but she could not block out the sounds, shouting, the clash of steel, the howls of wolves who were not howling in play. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes that felt like hours. Elara lost track of time in the darkness beneath the tree. She waited for the word. She waited for her mother's voice to call out sunflower through the trees, telling her it was safe to come home. The word never came. As the night wore on, the sounds of fighting grew fewer and farther apart, until finally, there was only silence. The kind of silence that felt heavier than any noise had been. Elara stayed hidden long after the silence began, too afraid to move, too afraid of what she might find if she crawled out from beneath the tree. When the first light of morning touched the forest floor, hunger and thirst finally forced her out of hiding. Her legs were stiff, and her whole body shook as she pushed aside the branches and crawled into the open. The forest around her looked the same as it always had, green and quiet and untouched, as if nothing terrible had happened at all. But when she looked toward the village, she saw the smoke still rising, thin and gray against the morning sky. She did not go back. Some instinct deep inside her, older than her 10 years, told her that going back would mean seeing something she could never unsee. Instead, she remembered her mother's words. Go deeper, find the twisted oak, find the river that never freezes. It took her most of the day to find the twisted oak, a massive tree with a trunk that curled in on itself like a spiral, deep enough in the forest that the light barely reached the ground beneath it. She had been there once before, on a trip with her mother to gather herbs, and something about the memory of that safe, ordinary day made her chest ache with a grief she did not yet have words for. Near the twisted oak, she found the river her mother had described, a narrow ribbon of water that moved fast and clear, even in the coldest months. She knelt beside it and drank until her thirst was gone, and then she sat back against a rock and finally let herself cry, quietly, the way her mother had taught her to do when she was frightened and needed to stay hidden. She did not know yet that she would spend the next 15 years of her life in these woods. She did not know that the world beyond the trees had changed forever, that her pack no longer existed, that the silver wolf crest belonged to a young man named Draven Ashbourne, who would one day rule as the most powerful alpha king in the land. She did not know that his name would become the center of every nightmare she had for years to come, or that fate had plans for the two of them that neither could imagine on that terrible night. All Elara knew, as the sun set on her first day alone, was that she was 10 years old, and she was the last of her family, and she had made a promise to her mother that she intended to keep no matter what it cost her. She built a small shelter of branches and leaves against the base of the twisted oak, copying the technique her father had once shown her during a hunting trip, back when hunting trips were adventures and not survival. She was clumsy at first, and the shelter collapsed twice before she managed to make it stand. But by the time darkness fell completely, she had a small, crooked space to curl into, hidden from the wind and from anyone who might be searching the forest for survivors. She did not sleep much that first night. Every sound made her flinch. Every rustle of leaves made her heart pound, as if the warriors in silver armor might burst through the trees at any moment. But no one came. The forest stayed quiet, and slowly, exhaustion won out over fear, and she drifted into a shallow, restless sleep. In her dream, she saw her mother's face, calm and steady, despite the chaos around them. She saw her father's back, turned toward danger to protect the people he loved. And somewhere in the dream, though she could not see his face clearly, she felt the presence of someone else, someone connected to the fire and the smoke, someone whose shadow would stretch across her entire life whether she wanted it to or not. She woke before dawn, cold and stiff, but alive. She reminded herself of her promise. She was the last of her family, and she had to live, no matter what it cost. She did not know yet how long that promise would take to fulfill, or how strange and unexpected the ending would be. She only knew that the forest was her home now, and that somewhere beyond its borders, the world had changed in ways she was too young to understand. For the next several days, Elara did not stray far from the twisted oak. She rationed the small handful of berries she found nearby, careful not to eat the ones she did not recognize, remembering her mother's warnings about which plants in the forest were safe and which were not. She drank from the river each morning and evening, and she slept curled inside her crooked shelter, listening to the sounds of the forest slowly become familiar instead of frightening. She thought often about going back to the village, just once, just to see if anyone else had survived. But every time she considered it, she remembered her mother's final words, spoken with such urgency that they had carved themselves into her memory forever. Do not trust anyone who follows you. Live, no matter what it costs. She did not know who might still be searching for survivors of the massacre. She did not know if the warriors in silver armor had orders to find and finish what they had started. All she knew was that the forest offered her a kind of safety the village no longer could, and so she stayed, day after day, learning to survive in a world that had taken everything from her in a single night. By the end of her first week alone, Elara had stopped crying every night. She had not stopped grieving, not truly, not for many years to come, but she had started, in small and quiet ways, to adapt. She learned to move silently through the underbrush. She learned which sounds belonged to the forest and which did not. She learned to be patient, to wait, to watch. She did not know it yet, but these were the exact skills that would keep her alive for the next 15 years. She did not know that the forest would become not just her hiding place, but her teacher, shaping her into someone unrecognizable from the laughing, carefree child she had been before the fire. She did not know that somewhere far beyond the trees, a young man was growing into the very king whose warriors had destroyed her family, carrying his own burdens and his own confusion about the night that had changed both of their lives forever. All Elara knew, as she watched the sun rise over the twisted oak on the 8th morning of her new life, was that she was still breathing. And for now, that had to be enough. 3 years passed in the forest, and Elara Voss was no longer the soft, laughing child she had once been. At 13, her hands were calloused from climbing trees and digging for roots. Her legs were strong from years of walking silently across uneven ground. Her eyes, once bright and curious, now carried a sharpness that made grown hunters uneasy whenever they caught a glimpse of her before she vanished into the trees. She had built herself a proper shelter by then, tucked into a hollow beneath a rocky outcrop not far from the twisted oak. It was dry and hidden, invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. She had learned to trap rabbits using twine made from woven vines, to identify which mushrooms would nourish her and which would kill her, to read the weather by the color of the sky and the behavior of the birds. She was, in every sense that mattered, wild now. But she had not forgotten who she used to be. Every night before she slept, she whispered the names of her parents into the darkness, a small ritual to keep their memory alive. She whispered her promise too, the one she had made on the worst night of her life. Live, no matter what it costs. Some nights the promise felt like a gift. Other nights it felt like a burden too heavy for a young girl to carry alone. She had ventured near the edge of the forest only a handful of times since the fire, always at night, always careful to stay hidden. What she had seen on those rare trips confirmed what she already suspected. Her village was gone, reduced to scorched foundations and overgrown ruins that nature was slowly reclaiming. New wolves patrolled the borders of the territory now, wearing the same silver wolf crest that had haunted her nightmares for 3 years. She had learned, through fragments of conversation overheard from a safe distance, that the land now belonged to the Ashbourne pack, ruled by a king whose name was spoken with a mixture of respect and fear. She did not care about his name. She did not care about his kingdom or his laws or his warriors. She only cared about staying hidden, staying alive, and staying far away from anyone wearing that crest. One afternoon, while checking a snare she had set near a shallow creek, Elara heard voices. She froze instantly, dropping low into the underbrush the way she had trained herself to do at the first sign of danger. 2 men in patrol uniforms were walking along the creek bed, their voices carrying easily across the quiet forest. "They say a pack lived out this way once," one of them said, "before the old king's men wiped them out." "Voss pack," the other replied. "Nasty business. I heard the young Alpha, the one who is king now, was barely more than a boy when his father ordered it. Some say he did not even understand what he was doing until it was already done." Ilara's whole body went rigid. She had never known the name of the family responsible for destroying hers. She had never wanted to know, had told herself for 3 years that the details did not matter, that revenge was a luxury she could not afford, while she was simply trying to survive. But hearing it now, spoken so casually by strangers who had no idea she was hiding just a few feet away, something inside her cracked open. Ashbourne, the first man said. King Draven Ashbourne, Cold One, that man, doesn't talk about his father much. Doesn't talk about much of anything, from what I hear. The name embedded itself in Ilara's mind like a splinter she could not remove. Draven Ashbourne, the boy who had become king, the one whose warriors had burned her village and taken her parents from her. She did not know, in that moment, whether he had given the order himself or simply followed his father's command, and she told herself it did not matter. A crest was a crest. Blood was blood. Someone had to answer for what happened to her family, and now, finally, she had a name to attach to that debt. The patrol moved on eventually, their voices fading into the distance, and Ilara remained hidden in the underbrush for a long time afterward, staring at nothing, turning the name over and over in her mind. Draven Ashbourne. She did not act on the anger that night, or the night after that. She was 13, alone, and far too small to challenge a king, but something shifted inside her all the same. The vague, formless grief she had carried since the fire began to sharpen into something with an edge, something with a direction. She was no longer simply surviving. She was waiting. Over the following months, Ilara began to venture closer to the forest's edge more often, always cautious, always ready to disappear at the first sign of danger. She watched the patrols that moved along the border, learning their routines, their schedules, the paths they favored. She told herself she was only gathering information, only being careful. But some quiet part of her knew she was also looking for opportunities, small ways to strike back against a kingdom that had taken everything from her. Her first act of quiet defiance came almost by accident. She discovered a trap set by Ashbourne hunters, meant to catch forest animals for the king's table, and instead of leaving it alone, she disabled it, freeing a young doe that had been caught inside. It was a small thing, hardly worth noticing to anyone but her, but it felt like something. It felt like a tiny piece of control in a world that had stolen everything else from her. She began doing it more often after that, disabling traps, redirecting patrols by leaving false tracks. Once, she even managed to steal a satchel of supplies from a careless young warrior who had wandered too far from his group and fallen asleep against a tree. She never took more than she needed, and she was always careful never to be seen. But slowly, over the following years, rumors began to spread among the Ashbourne patrols about a strange presence in the forest, a shadow that seemed to know the woods better than anyone alive. Ilara heard these rumors herself, sometimes, crouched in the underbrush listening to soldiers complain about missing supplies or sabotaged traps. She never confirmed or denied anything, of course. She simply listened and smiled to herself, a small, private satisfaction that felt like the first real joy she had experienced since the fire. By the time she was 16, the rumors had grown into something closer to legend. Soldiers spoke of a ghost that haunted the deep forest, a spirit of the Voss pack that had never truly left. Some believed it, genuinely frightened by the stories. Others dismissed it as nonsense, blaming missing supplies on ordinary wildlife or careless bookkeeping. But the legend persisted, growing a little more elaborate with each passing season, until even soldiers who had never set foot in the deep forest knew the stories of the ghost wolf who protected the ruins of the old Voss territory. Ilara found a strange comfort in the legend, even as she recognized how dangerous it was for her to become notable in any way. A legend drew attention, attention drew hunters, and hunters, if they were skilled enough or lucky enough, might eventually find the girl behind the myth. She knew this. She understood the risk, but something in her, some stubborn ember of defiance that had survived the fire along with her, refused to stop entirely. She was careful, though. She never allowed herself to be seen clearly. She never used the same hiding spot twice in a row. She learned to move without leaving tracks, to mask her scent with crushed herbs and river mud, techniques she had pieced together through years of trial and error, and a few fragmented memories of things her mother had once taught her before the world fell apart. Her 17th winter was the hardest she had faced since the very first year in the forest. Food grew scarce, and the cold settled deep into her bones despite the layers of animal hide she had sewn together over the years, using bone needles and dried sinew. She fell ill for nearly 2 weeks, feverish and weak, forced to rely on stored supplies and sheer stubbornness to survive until her strength returned. During the worst of the fever, she dreamed constantly of her parents, of the fire, of a young man's face she had never actually seen, but somehow pictured clearly in her feverish mind. Cold eyes beneath dark hair, a crown resting heavy on his brow. When she finally recovered, something in her had changed again. The fever had burned away whatever softness remained from her childhood, leaving behind someone leaner, harder, more determined. She began training herself more seriously after that winter, no longer content to simply survive. She practiced with a blade she had crafted from scavenged metal, sharpening her reflexes against imaginary opponents, preparing herself for a confrontation she could not yet name, but somehow knew was coming. She did not know, during those long years of training and waiting, that the king whose name haunted her nightmares was struggling with his own burdens far beyond the forest's edge. She did not know that Draven Ashbourne rarely spoke of the massacre that had secured his throne, that he carried his own quiet unease about a night from his youth that he barely remembered clearly, having been little more than a boy following his father's commands, without understanding their true weight. She knew none of this, and in her mind, he remained a simple villain, a name to blame, a symbol of everything the fire had taken from her. By her 18th year in hiding, though she was only 20 years old, Ilara Voss had become something the forest itself seemed to protect. She moved through the trees like she was part of them, silent and unseen, feared by soldiers who spoke her legend around campfires without knowing her true name. She had survived a decade in the wilderness, alone, grieving, and growing sharper with every passing season. She still whispered her parents' names each night. She still repeated her promise, though its meaning had shifted over the years, from simple survival into something closer to purpose. She was no longer just trying to live. She was waiting for the day the debt would finally be paid, though she could not yet imagine how strange and unexpected that reckoning would turn out to be. The legend of the ghost wolf had become so widespread by the time Ilara turned 22 that even the king's court had heard whispers of it. Soldiers who patrolled the old Voss territory told stories of arrows that missed their marks without explanation, of supplies that vanished overnight, of a shadow glimpsed at the edge of firelight that disappeared the instant anyone turned to look directly at it. Most dismissed the tales as exaggeration born from boredom and superstition. A few, the ones who had actually served along that border, were not so certain. Ilara herself had grown into her role as the forest's unseen guardian, without ever intending to claim such a title. She still thought of herself simply as a survivor, a girl who had lost everything and built a new, strange life out of the wreckage. But her actions over the years had taken on a shape larger than herself. She freed captured Omegas being transported through the forest by Ashbourne patrols, cutting their bindings under cover of darkness, and vanishing before anyone could catch more than a glimpse of her. She sabotaged shipments meant to resupply border outposts, slowing the king's reach into territories that had once belonged to families like her own. She never killed. She had promised herself that much, early on, some instinct telling her that becoming a killer would mean losing the last piece of herself the fire had not already taken. But she disrupted. She frustrated. She made the Ashbourne presence in that region more difficult, one small act of rebellion at a time. She had also, over the years, begun quietly helping other survivors of pack conflicts, who found their way into the deeper woods, fleeing violence or persecution from various corners of the kingdom. She never let them see her clearly, never gave them her name, but she left food near their hiding places, redirected patrols away from their trails, and occasionally guided them, from a careful distance, towards safer paths out of dangerous territory. Word of a mysterious protector spread among these wanderers too, adding another layer to the growing legend that Ilara herself barely recognized as being about her. She did not think of herself as a hero. She thought of herself as someone settling a debt that could never truly be repaid, one small act of defiance at a time, against a kingdom that had taken her family and her childhood in a single night of fire. On a cold morning in early spring, Ilara was tracking a patrol that had strayed farther into the forest than usual, curious about their unusual route. She moved silently through the underbrush, staying low, staying downwind, watching from a safe distance as the 6 soldiers made their way toward an old clearing that had once been the outer edge of her village's farmland. She had not been to that clearing in years, avoiding it out of a grief too heavy to face directly, and seeing the soldiers approach it now filled her with an unexpected surge of anger. She watched as they began setting up equipment, unrolling maps, discussing something in low voices she could not quite make out from her hiding place. It looked less like a routine patrol and more like a survey, as if they were planning something for that land, something that would disturb ground that Ilara considered sacred, however overgrown and forgotten it had become. She made a decision in that moment that she would later reflect on as reckless, though at the time it felt entirely justified. She began working her way closer, intending to overhear their conversation clearly enough to understand what they were planning, so she could figure out how to disrupt it later. She was skilled at moving unseen, more skilled than any of these soldiers could have anticipated, and she managed to close the distance to within a few dozen feet without being detected. What she heard confirmed her fears. The soldiers were discussing plans to clear the old farmland for a new outpost, a permanent structure that would put a garrison of Ashbourne soldiers directly at the edge of her forest, close enough to make her decade of careful hiding far more dangerous than it had ever been before. She felt a cold, familiar anger rising in her chest, the same anger that had first taken root the day she learned the name Draven Ashbourne. She stayed hidden until the patrol finished their survey and began the long walk back toward the border, and then she followed them for a while longer, committing their route and their pace to memory, already planning how she might disrupt this new project before it could take root. She was so absorbed in her planning that she nearly missed the sound of a second group approaching from a different direction, moving with far more purpose and far more silence than the surveying patrol had managed. By the time she noticed them, it was almost too late. She dropped low into a thicket of brush, heart pounding, as a group of 6 warriors moved past her hiding place, clearly a hunting party of some kind, tracking something through the forest with practiced precision. She held perfectly still, controlling her breathing the way she had trained herself to do over countless close calls throughout the years, and watched as they passed within a few feet of where she hid. At the center of the group walked a man Ilara had never seen before, though something about his presence made every instinct in her body go on high alert. He moved differently than the soldiers around him, with an easy, contained power that suggested strength held carefully in check. His dark hair was cut short and practical, his expression unreadable, his eyes scanning the forest with the sharp focus of someone accustomed to command. Even without seeing any crest or insignia clearly from her hidden position, Ilara understood instinctively that this man was important, someone whose presence in the forest was not routine. She did not know, in that moment, that she was looking at Draven Ashbourne himself, the king, whose name had haunted her nightmares for 12 years. She only knew that something about him set every nerve in her body on edge, a strange mixture of danger and something else she could not name, something unfamiliar and unsettling that she pushed aside immediately, telling herself it was simply fear, simply the natural response to seeing a man who commanded such obvious authority. The hunting party moved on, and Ilara remained frozen in her hiding spot for several minutes after they had passed, waiting for her heart rate to slow, waiting for the strange, unsettled feeling in her chest to fade. It did not fade entirely, not even after the forest had returned to its normal quiet sounds, birds calling and wind moving through the leaves overhead. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself she had simply been startled by the unexpected appearance of such an obviously important figure so deep in territory she considered her own. But some small, quiet part of her, buried beneath 12 years of careful survival and hardened resolve, wondered about the strange pull she had felt when her eyes landed on that unfamiliar man, a pull she did not yet have the words to understand. She spent the following days avoiding that section of the forest entirely, redirecting her usual patrols and hiding spots farther from the border where the hunting party had appeared. She told herself it was simple caution, avoiding an area that had suddenly become more dangerous with increased Ashbourne activity. She did not examine too closely why the memory of that man's face, the sharp focus of his eyes scanning the trees, kept surfacing in her mind at unexpected moments, disrupting her concentration in ways nothing had managed to do in years. She did not know that the hunting party had been searching for signs of the very legend she had unknowingly built over the past decade, that reports of sabotaged patrols and mysteriously freed captives had finally reached the king's court with enough frequency and detail that Draven Ashbourne had decided to investigate personally. She did not know that her careful decade of rebellion, meant to remain anonymous and unremarkable, had finally drawn the attention of the one person in the kingdom she most needed to avoid. She continued her quiet campaign of resistance over the following weeks, disrupting the survey work at the old clearing, redirecting the patrol schedules meant to secure the new outpost site, moving with the same careful precision she had always used. But something had shifted in the forest's atmosphere, a heightened vigilance among the soldiers that made her work more difficult and more dangerous than it had been in years. She did not yet understand that the king himself had taken a personal interest in finding the ghost wolf of the old Voss territory. She did not understand that her carefully guarded anonymity was beginning to crack, piece by piece, patrol by patrol, as Draven Ashbourne's hunting parties grew more organized and more determined. She only knew that the forest felt different now, charged with a tension she could not quite explain, and that somewhere beneath her anger and her caution, a strange curiosity had taken root about the man whose face she could not stop remembering, however hard she tried. She did not know it yet, but the collision that would upend everything she thought she understood about her life, her purpose, and her enemy was only weeks away. King Draven Ashbourne had never believed in ghosts, and he did not believe in them now, despite the growing pile of reports on his desk describing a mysterious figure haunting the old Voss territory. He believed in patterns, in evidence, in the kind of careful reasoning that had allowed him to hold his throne steady for the past several years, despite the challenges that came with ruling a kingdom built on his father's ambition and his father's mistakes. The reports were troubling, not because he believed in supernatural explanations, but because someone, some very real and very skilled person, had been operating in that forest for years without being caught. Supplies vanished from supply lines that should have been secure. Captives being transported for sentencing disappeared from custody without a trace, their bindings cut cleanly, their guards left confused and humiliated. Patrol routes seemed to be anticipated with an accuracy that suggested detailed knowledge of Ashbourne military schedules, knowledge that should not have been available to anyone outside his own command structure. He had dismissed the early reports as isolated incidents, the kind of small disruptions any large territory experienced from time to time, but the pattern had grown too consistent to ignore, stretching back years according to the older records his advisors had compiled at his request. Someone had been living in that forest, watching his soldiers, disrupting his operations, for far longer than made sense for an ordinary criminal or rival pack member seeking easy plunder. He had decided, finally, that the matter required his personal attention, not because he believed the exaggerated tales his soldiers told around their campfires, stories of a ghost wolf who could vanish into thin air, but because whoever was responsible for this decade of quiet sabotage clearly possessed skills and knowledge that made them a genuine concern for the security of his kingdom's borders. He led the hunting party himself, keeping the group small and disciplined, choosing only his most trusted and capable warriors for the task. He had walked past the edge of the old Voss territory countless times over the years, without giving it much thought beyond a distant, uncomfortable awareness of the history buried there, a history he preferred not to examine too closely. Being back in that forest now, deliberately searching its depths for the source of years of quiet resistance, stirred a discomfort in him that he did not fully understand and did not have time to examine. He had been young, barely more than a boy, when his father ordered the assault on the Voss pack. He remembered fragments of that night more clearly than he wished he did. The fire, the chaos, his father's cold instructions, delivered with an authority that had felt impossible to question at the time. He had followed orders that night, as he had followed orders for most of his childhood, understanding only years later, once the weight of his own throne had settled onto his shoulders, how much of that night he still did not fully understand. He did not speak of it often, His advisors knew better than to bring up the details of how the Ashbourne family had secured control over the old Voss territory, and Draven himself preferred to focus on the present, on the responsibilities of ruling a kingdom that stretched far beyond the borders of that one small, tragic conflict from his youth. But some nights, when sleep proved difficult, fragments of that fire still found their way into his mind, uninvited and unwelcome. He pushed those thoughts aside as he led his hunting party deeper into the forest, focusing instead on the practical task at hand. Whoever had been operating in this territory for years was skilled, patient, and clearly intelligent. Catching them would require more than simple brute force. It would require patience of his own, careful observation, and a willingness to think several steps ahead of an opponent who had, so far, managed to stay several steps ahead of everyone else. They had been tracking faint signs for 2 days when Draven first noticed something unusual. A set of tracks that appeared and disappeared with a precision that suggested deliberate concealment rather than accident. Most people, even skilled hunters, left behind small inconsistencies in their attempts to hide their trail. These tracks showed none of the usual mistakes. Whoever had made them understood the forest with an intimacy that went beyond simple training. He signaled his warriors to slow their pace, to move with greater caution, sensing that they were closer to their target than any of the previous search efforts had managed to get. He did not yet know that the very person they were hunting had, only days earlier, watched his hunting party pass within a few feet of her hiding place, her heart pounding with an unfamiliar mixture of fear and something else entirely that neither of them yet understood. The hunt continued for another week, growing more focused as they narrowed down the areas where the mysterious figure seemed to be operating. Draven found himself unexpectedly absorbed in the challenge, drawn in by the sheer skill on display in every carefully hidden trail and every perfectly timed disruption to his patrol schedules. Whoever this person was, they were not simply lucky. They were exceptionally capable, and some part of him, the part that had spent years surrounded by advisors and soldiers who rarely challenged him in any meaningful way, found the pursuit almost invigorating. He did not expect, on the morning everything changed, to find what he found. His hunting party had split into smaller groups to cover more ground, and Draven himself had wandered slightly ahead of his remaining companions, following a trail that seemed fresher than any they had encountered so far. The forest around him grew quieter as he moved deeper, the kind of quiet that suggested something, or someone, was nearby, watching, waiting. He rounded a cluster of dense brush and found himself face to face, for the first time, with the legend his soldiers had spent years whispering about around their campfires. She was not a ghost. She was a woman, lean and sharp-eyed, dressed in clothing crafted from stitched animal hides that spoke of years spent surviving far from any settlement. Her hair was tangled and unkempt, her skin weathered from years of exposure to sun and wind, but her eyes, when they met his, held an intelligence and a fury that struck him with unexpected force. Neither of them moved for a long moment, both too startled by the sudden encounter to react immediately. Draven took in the details of her appearance with the same careful attention he applied to everything, noting the crude but functional blade at her hip, the alert readiness in her stance, the way her eyes flicked briefly toward the trees around them, calculating escape routes even as she remained frozen in place. And then something happened that neither of them had any way to prepare for. The moment their eyes truly met, something ancient and undeniable surged through both of them at once. A recognition that went deeper than sight, deeper than thought. A pull so powerful, it felt like the forest itself had gone still around them. Alara felt it as a jolt through her entire body, an overwhelming, unwelcome certainty that struck her exactly as her mother's stories had once described. Stories about the rare and powerful bond between true mates that some wolves were fortunate, or unfortunate, enough to experience. She had never expected to feel it herself, had assumed, given the isolation of her life, that she would never encounter the person fate had chosen for her. She had certainly never expected to feel it while staring into the eyes of a man she instinctively recognized, with a certainty she could not explain, as connected somehow to the warriors who had destroyed her family. Draven felt the same jolt, the same undeniable pull, though he did not yet understand its full significance the way Alara did. He only knew that something about this wild, fierce woman in front of him had struck him with a force he had never experienced before, an instant and overwhelming awareness that felt entirely different from anything he had encountered in his years of ruling and leading and making difficult decisions. For several long seconds, neither of them moved, caught in a moment that neither had asked for and neither fully understood. And then Alara's survival instincts, honed over 12 years of careful hiding, finally overrode her shock, and she turned and ran, disappearing into the dense undergrowth with a speed and skill that left Draven staring after her, momentarily too stunned by everything that had just happened to immediately give chase. By the time he recovered enough to pursue her, she was gone, vanished into the forest she knew better than anyone alive. He stood alone in the small clearing where their eyes had met, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of the hunt, trying to make sense of what had just happened, and failing entirely. He did not know her name. He did not know where she had come from, or how long she had been living in that forest. But he knew, with the same undeniable certainty that had struck him the moment their eyes met, that he would not stop searching until he found her again. Alara ran until her lungs burned, until the muscles in her legs screamed for rest, until she was certain no one could possibly still be following her through the dense, tangled undergrowth of the deep forest. When she finally allowed herself to stop, collapsing against the trunk of a moss-covered tree, her whole body shook, not from exhaustion, but from the strange, overwhelming sensation still coursing through her chest. She pressed her hand against her sternum, as if she could physically push away the feeling, the undeniable pull that had struck her the moment her eyes met the stranger's. She knew what it meant. Her mother had told her stories, years ago, about the mate bond, about how some wolves found themselves connected to another person in a way that went beyond simple attraction or affection, a bond woven into the very core of who they were. She had always thought of it as a beautiful thing, back when she was young, and had no reason to fear it. Now, 12 years after losing everything to a fire lit by men wearing the silver wolf crest, the idea of being fated to someone connected to that crest felt like the cruelest joke the universe could possibly play on her. She had not seen his insignia clearly, not in the panic of the moment, but something about him, the authority in his bearing, the way his warriors had seemed to orbit around him during the hunting party she had spotted weeks earlier, told her exactly who he must be. She refused, at first, to let herself think the name, as if avoiding it might somehow undo what had already happened between them. But the thought pushed its way into her mind regardless, relentless and unwelcome. Draven Ashbourne, the king, the one whose name had haunted her nightmares for over a decade. The very man responsible, whether directly or through his father's orders, for the destruction of everything she had once loved. She spent that night curled in her hidden shelter, sleep refusing to come despite her exhaustion, her mind circling endlessly around the impossible cruelty of what fate had apparently decided for her. She told herself it did not matter. A bond was not a chain. She had survived 12 years alone in the wilderness, through sheer stubbornness and refusal to accept anything less than her own freedom, and she was not about to let some ancient, mysterious pull dictate the rest of her life, especially not toward the very man whose family had taken everything from her. She resolved, as the first light of morning crept through the branches overhead, to simply avoid him entirely. The forest was vast. She had spent over a decade learning every hidden corner of it, every secret trail and hidden cave. Surely she could avoid one man, no matter how determined he seemed to be in his pursuit. Her resolve lasted exactly 4 days. On the 5th day after their encounter, Alara noticed a change in the pattern of Ashbourne patrols moving through the forest. Instead of the usual scattered groups following predictable routes, she began seeing more organized search parties, moving with careful precision through the areas she knew best, systematically covering ground in a way that suggested someone with detailed knowledge of the terrain was directing their efforts. She realized, with a sinking feeling in her stomach, that the king himself must be leading this new, more focused search. And she understood, with the same certainty that had struck her during their first encounter, that he was searching not just for the legendary ghost wolf who had disrupted his operations for years, but specifically for her, the woman whose eyes had met his in that clearing. She became more careful after that, more cautious than she had been in years, avoiding even her most trusted hiding spots in favor of new, unfamiliar corners of the forest she had rarely explored. She stopped her usual activities entirely, no longer disabling traps or redirecting patrols, focusing instead on remaining completely invisible until the increased search efforts eventually died down. But the search did not die down. If anything, it intensified as the days passed, the patrols growing more numerous, more organized, closing in on the areas where she had once felt safest. She began to suspect that the king was not simply searching randomly, but was somehow anticipating her movements, predicting where she might go, based on some understanding of the forest that matched or even exceeded her own hard-won knowledge. She did not yet understand the mate bond well enough to know that it worked in both directions, that Draven, too, felt an inexplicable pull toward her location, a strange instinct guiding his search efforts in ways he could not fully explain even to himself. She only knew that despite her best efforts at evasion, the distance between them seemed to be shrinking with each passing day, as if some force beyond her control was slowly drawing them back together, no matter how hard she fought against it. 2 weeks after their first encounter, Ilara made a critical mistake. Exhausted from days of constant vigilance and disrupted sleep, she allowed herself a few hours of rest in a shelter she had used only once before, believing it obscure enough to remain safe for one night. She did not know that this particular shelter sat directly along a path that some deep, wordless instinct had been guiding Draven toward for the past several days, an instinct neither of them yet understood, as the pull of their bond growing stronger with proximity. She woke to the sound of footsteps, far too close, far too quiet to belong to an ordinary patrol. Her eyes snapped open, every instinct screaming danger, and she was on her feet with her blade drawn before she had even fully processed the situation. Years of training taking over in the absence of conscious thought. Draven stood at the entrance of her small shelter, alone, having separated himself from his search party hours earlier when the pull toward her location had become too strong and too specific to ignore. He raised his hands slowly, showing her he carried no weapon of his own, his eyes steady on hers despite the obvious tension radiating from her entire body. "I am not here to hurt you," he said, his voice low and calm, though Ilara could see the same unsettled awareness in his eyes that she felt in her own chest. "I only want to talk." "I have nothing to say to you," Ilara replied, her blade still raised, her body coiled, and ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. "Or to anyone wearing that crest." Something flickered across his expression at her words, a flash of understanding that surprised her, though she pushed the observation aside, too focused on the immediate danger of his presence to examine it closely. "You know who I am," he said. It was not quite a question. "I know exactly who you are," she said, her voice sharpening, with 12 years of buried grief finally finding an outlet. "I know what your family did. I know what your warriors took from me." Draven's jaw tightened, and for a moment, something that looked almost like guilt passed across his face, though it vanished quickly, replaced by the careful, controlled expression of a man accustomed to hiding his true reactions. "Tell me your name," he said, instead of responding directly to her accusation. "No," Ilara said, and before he could react, she darted past him, using the momentary opening created by his surprise to escape into the trees, running with everything her exhausted body had left to give. He did not chase her this time, some instinct telling him that pursuit would only deepen the fear and hostility already radiating from her, would only push her further away, when what he desperately needed, for reasons he was only beginning to understand himself, was to find a way to draw her closer instead. He stood alone in the abandoned shelter for a long time after she disappeared, processing the strange whirlwind of emotions their brief encounter had stirred inside him. She had confirmed, without realizing it, exactly what he had begun to suspect since their first meeting. Her hostility, her mention of what his family had taken from her, all of it pointed toward a connection to the Voss massacre that had haunted the edges of his conscience for over a decade. He returned to his warriors that evening, with instructions to scale back the search efforts, telling them only that he needed time to consider a new approach. In truth, he needed time to sit with the growing, uncomfortable certainty settling into his chest, the understanding that the woman fate had bound him to was somehow connected, deeply and painfully, to the darkest chapter of his own family's history. He did not yet know the full truth. He did not yet understand that the woman who had run from him twice now was the last surviving member of the very pack his father had ordered destroyed, that her hatred for his family was not some abstract grievance, but a wound as raw and personal as any he could imagine. But some part of him, the part connected to her now through a bond neither of them had chosen or asked for, already sensed that the truth, whatever it turned out to be, would demand more of him than he had ever been asked to give. Draven did not sleep well in the days following his second encounter with the woman from the forest. He found himself distracted during council meetings, his mind drifting back to the fierce, wary look in her eyes, the raw accusation in her voice when she spoke of what his family had taken from her. He had ruled his kingdom with careful, measured control for years, rarely allowing personal matters to interfere with his responsibilities. Now, for the first time since taking the throne, he found himself struggling to focus on anything beyond the mystery of who she was, and what connection bound her so tightly to his family's darkest actions. He began quietly reviewing old records from the early years of his father's reign, documents he had avoided examining too closely in the past, uncomfortable with what they might reveal about a period of his life he barely remembered clearly. He found reports detailing the assault on the Vospak, dry, clinical accounts of a military operation that had secured valuable territory for the Ashbourne kingdom. The reports mentioned casualties without dwelling on them, listed strategic gains without acknowledging the human cost behind them. He found no record of any survivors. Officially, the Vospak had been entirely eliminated that night, its bloodline ended, its territory absorbed cleanly into Ashbourne lands. But sitting across from a woman whose eyes burned with a hatred rooted specifically in what his family had taken from her, Draven found himself doubting the completeness of those old reports. He decided, after several days of quiet consideration, that direct pursuit through armed patrols was clearly not the answer. She had evaded organized search efforts for over a decade, and his brief encounters with her had shown him just how skilled and how deeply frightened she was of anyone connected to his crest. Chasing her with soldiers would only confirm every fear she already carried, would only push her further into hiding. Instead, he began going into the forest alone, unarmed except for a simple blade at his hip, deliberately leaving his warriors behind, despite their concerned objections. He told himself he was gathering information, understanding the terrain, preparing for whatever confrontation might eventually come. In truth, he was searching for her, drawn by an instinct he still did not fully understand, though he had begun to suspect, with growing certainty, exactly what that instinct meant. He had heard the old stories, of course, the legends about true mates, and the powerful, undeniable bond that sometimes formed between two wolves destined for each other. He had never expected to experience it himself, had assumed, given the political complexities of his position, that any marriage he eventually made would be a matter of strategy rather than fate. Feeling that overwhelming pull the moment his eyes met hers in the forest had shaken him more deeply than he was willing to admit to anyone, including himself. It took him nearly 3 weeks of careful, patient searching before he found her again. He had learned, through careful observation and a growing understanding of the pull connecting them, to sense roughly when he was moving closer to her location. A strange, wordless instinct guiding his steps, even when he had no concrete evidence to follow. He found her one evening near a small stream, kneeling to fill a water pouch, unaware of his approach until he was close enough that retreat was no longer a simple option. She spun to face him the moment she sensed his presence, her blade drawn instantly, her body dropping into a defensive stance that spoke of years of practiced readiness. "Stay back," she warned, her voice sharp with tension. Draven stopped several paces away, keeping his hands visible, his own blade still sheathed at his hip. "I am alone," he said. "No warriors, no patrol. I only want to talk to you." "You keep saying that," Elara replied, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "And yet you keep hunting me through my own forest." "I stopped the organized search weeks ago," he said. "I came alone because I did not want to frighten you, though I can see that has not worked as well as I hoped." Something in his tone, quiet and sincere despite the obvious tension between them, made Elara hesitate, her blade lowering slightly even as her guard remained high. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Answers," Draven said honestly. "You said I took something from you. I want to understand what that means." Elara's jaw tightened, old grief and anger warring visibly across her expression. You truly do not know, she said, disbelief coloring her voice. 15 years, and you truly have no idea what your family did to mine. Tell me, Draven said, his voice steady despite the growing unease building in his chest. Please. She studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing whether to trust him with words she had carried alone for so many years. Finally, something in her posture shifted, exhaustion perhaps, or the simple, overwhelming weight of carrying her story alone for over a decade. The Voss pack, she said finally. 15 years ago, your father's warriors burned our village to the ground. They killed my parents. They killed everyone. I was 10 years old, and I hid in these woods while my whole world disappeared. The words landed on Draven like physical blows, each one confirming the growing suspicion he had carried since their first meeting, each one deepening the cold, sick feeling settling into his stomach. Voss, he repeated quietly, you are the last of the Voss pack. I am the only one who survived, Ilara said, her voice steady despite the tremor of old pain beneath it. For 15 years, I have lived in these woods, because I have nowhere else to go, and no one left to trust. And now fate has decided that the man responsible for destroying my family is somehow supposed to be my mate. Do you understand now why I keep running from you? Draven stood in silence for a long moment, the full weight of her words settling over him. He remembered, in fragments that had never fully made sense until now, the confusion of that night from his own youth, the fire, his father's cold instructions, his own uncertain compliance with orders he had not fully understood at the time. He had been young, barely more than a child himself, following the commands of a father whose ambition had shaped every aspect of his early life. I was 14 years old that night, he said finally, his voice quieter than Ilara had heard it before. My father ordered the assault. I do not remember understanding, at the time, what we were truly doing. I have spent years avoiding the details of that night, telling myself it was simply another chapter of history I did not need to examine closely. That does not undo what happened, Ilara said, though something in her voice had softened slightly, some small crack forming in the wall of anger she had built around herself. No, Draven agreed. It does not. But I swear to you, I did not understand the full weight of what happened that night until this very moment, hearing it from someone who lived through it. Ilara studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of deception, and finding, to her own surprise, only genuine, unsettled honesty. What do you want from me now? She asked again, her voice quieter this time. I do not know yet, Draven admitted, but I know I cannot simply walk away and pretend this conversation never happened. Whatever the bond between us means, whatever the history between our families demands, I owe you the truth, and I owe you the chance to decide what happens next. Ilara said nothing for a long moment, the weight of 15 years of grief and isolation pressing against the strange, unwelcome pull she still felt toward this man, despite everything he represented. Finally, she sheathed her blade, though she kept several careful paces of distance between them. I need time, she said finally. I do not trust you. I am not certain I ever will, but I will not run from you tonight. It was not forgiveness. It was not even the beginning of trust. But for two people bound together by fate and torn apart by history, it was, perhaps, the first small step toward something neither of them yet understood. The weeks that followed their conversation by the stream did not bring the easy resolution either of them might have hoped for. Ilara remained deeply wary of Draven, her years of hard-won survival instincts refusing to relax, simply because he had spoken with apparent honesty about his father's crimes. But she found herself, against every instinct telling her to stay away, agreeing to meet with him again, drawn by a combination of the undeniable bond between them and a cautious curiosity about the man behind the crest she had feared for so long. Their meetings became a strange, careful ritual over the following month. Draven continued to come alone, always unarmed except for a simple blade, always respectful of the careful distance Ilara maintained between them. They spoke, gradually, of small things at first, the practical details of how she had survived alone in the forest for 15 years, the skills she had developed, the losses she had endured. Draven listened more than he spoke, absorbing the details of a life that stood in such stark contrast to his own experience of growing up within the walls of a palace, surrounded by servants and advisors, and the constant weight of political expectation. He told her, in turn, about his own childhood, about a father whose ambition had left little room for warmth or genuine connection, about the years since taking the throne that he had spent trying to rule more justly than his father ever had, though the shadow of his father's actions continued to follow him in ways he was only beginning to fully understand. Ilara found herself, despite her deep reservations, beginning to see him as something more complicated than the simple villain she had built in her mind over 15 years of grief and isolation. He was not the monster who had lit the fire that destroyed her village. He had been a frightened, confused boy, following the orders of a father whose cruelty he had spent his adult life trying to counteract. It did not erase what had happened. It did not undo the loss she had carried for so long, but it complicated the simple narrative of hatred she had relied on to survive, and that complication frightened her almost as much as the man himself did. One evening, nearly 6 weeks after their first true conversation, Draven arrived at their usual meeting place with a proposal that surprised even himself with its boldness. "Come back with me," he said. "Not as a prisoner, not permanently, if you do not wish it. But let me show you that the kingdom my father built is not the only future available to the Ashbourne crest." Ilara's immediate instinct was refusal, sharp and automatic, after 15 years of avoiding anything connected to the palace that had ordered her family's destruction. "I cannot," she said. "I do not belong there. I never will." "You do not have to decide anything permanent," Draven said, his voice careful and measured, despite the obvious hope beneath his words. "But you have spent 15 years alone, surviving on instinct and fear. Do you not deserve the chance to see what else might be possible?" Ilara hesitated, the practical part of her mind recognizing the danger inherent in his suggestion, while some smaller, quieter part of her, the part connected to him through the bond neither of them had chosen, wondered what it might mean to finally step out of the shadows she had lived in for so long. She did not agree that night. It took several more weeks of careful conversation, of Draven's patient, consistent presence, before she finally allowed herself to consider his offer seriously. What ultimately convinced her was not any grand gesture or persuasive argument, but a simple, quiet moment when Draven admitted, with obvious difficulty, that he had begun actively working to dismantle the remaining influence of advisors who had served his father during the years of the Voss Pack's destruction, men whose ambitions had shaped the cruelty of that era, and who still held positions of power within his court. "I cannot undo what happened to your family," he told her, "but I can make certain the kind of thinking that allowed it to happen no longer has a place in how I rule. If you come with me, even briefly, you might see that effort for yourself." Something in his sincerity, the visible effort behind his words, finally cracked through enough of Ilara's defenses that she agreed, cautiously, to return with him to the palace, though she made clear the arrangement was temporary and reversible, that she remained free to leave at any moment she chose. The palace itself overwhelmed her in ways she had not anticipated. 15 years of living in the quiet, natural rhythms of the forest had left her unprepared for the noise and scale and constant activity of court life. She felt like an intruder among the polished stone halls and richly dressed courtiers, painfully aware of her own weathered, practical clothing and the wild, untamed quality of someone who had spent more time among trees than among people. Draven, to his credit, made every effort to ease her transition, arranging for her to have a private chamber far from the busiest sections of the palace, ensuring she was never pressured into court functions or formal introductions before she felt ready for them. He visited her regularly, continuing the same careful, patient conversations that had slowly built whatever fragile trust now existed between them. But not everyone within the palace welcomed Ilara's presence. Whispers spread quickly through the court about the wild woman the king had brought back from the forest, rumors that grew more elaborate and more suspicious with each retelling. Some courtiers viewed her as a curiosity, a strange novelty to be gossiped about at dinner. Others, particularly those who had served under Draven's father and still held positions of influence within the palace, viewed her presence with open hostility, recognizing in her a living reminder of a chapter in Ashbourne history they preferred to keep buried. Ilara noticed the hostile glances, the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered a room, and found herself retreating further into caution, her old instincts telling her that this palace, despite Draven's genuine efforts to make her feel welcome, remained a place of danger she could not fully trust. The tension came to a head nearly 2 months into her stay, when Alara overheard a conversation between two senior advisors, men who had clearly not expected anyone to be listening, discussing plans to quietly remove her from the palace before her presence could complicate the political stability Draven's father had worked so hard to secure. The conversation revealed, in chilling detail, that these same advisors had been instrumental in planning the original assault on the Voss Pack 15 years earlier. Men who had manipulated a young, impressionable Draven into carrying out his father's orders without fully understanding their consequences. Alara confronted Draven that same evening, her old anger and suspicion flaring back to the surface with renewed intensity. "Your father's men are still shaping your kingdom," she said, her voice sharp with betrayal. "The very people responsible for what happened to my family still hold power in your court, and you brought me here as though that meant nothing." Draven listened to her account with a growing, cold fury of his own, recognizing immediately the names of the advisors she described, men he had long suspected of holding too much lingering influence from his father's era, but had not yet found sufficient cause to remove from their positions. "Tell me everything you heard," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "This ends now." What followed was not simple or immediate, but it marked a turning point in both their relationship and in the direction of Draven's rule. He began, with Alara's account as his catalyst, a careful but determined investigation into the remaining influence of his father's old advisors, uncovering a web of manipulation and self-interest that had shaped far more of the kingdom's cruelty over the years than he had previously understood. For Alara, watching Draven take real, concrete action against the very people whose ambition had orchestrated her family's destruction offered something she had not expected to feel again after 15 years of isolation and grief. It offered, however fragile and uncertain, the first genuine flicker of hope that something resembling justice might still be possible, even after so many years of carrying her loss alone. The investigation into his father's old advisors consumed much of Draven's attention over the following weeks, but it did not consume all of it. Between council meetings and careful reviews of old records, he continued making time for Alara, their conversations growing longer and more comfortable as the weeks passed. She remained cautious, unwilling to let herself trust the palace or its people too completely, but her guard around Draven himself had softened considerably from the fierce, defensive stance she had maintained during their first encounters in the forest. She began venturing beyond her private chamber more often, exploring the palace gardens in the early mornings, before most of the court had risen, finding a quiet comfort in the carefully tended greenery that reminded her, in small ways, of the forest she still considered her true home. She avoided the busier sections of the palace whenever possible, but she no longer flinched at every unfamiliar sound, the way she had during her first weeks there. Draven found himself, during this period, more at peace than he had felt in years, despite the mounting political tension surrounding his investigation into his father's old advisors. Something about Alara's presence, her fierce independence and hard-won wisdom, grounded him in a way nothing else in his carefully controlled royal life ever had. He began looking forward to their conversations, with an eagerness that surprised him, drawn not just by the pull of their bond, but by genuine admiration for the woman she had become, despite everything she had endured. Their relationship deepened slowly, built on small moments rather than grand gestures. Draven learned that Alara loved the smell of rain on dry earth, a scent that reminded her of quiet mornings in the forest before tragedy had reshaped her entire life. Alara learned that Draven, despite his careful, controlled public persona, harbored a deep love for old maps and historical records, finding comfort in the patterns and lessons of the past, even as he worked to build a different future for his kingdom. She began to see him not as the symbol of destruction she had carried in her mind for 15 years, but as a man genuinely wrestling with the weight of his family's legacy, working, however imperfectly, to become someone better than the father who had shaped his early years. It did not erase her grief. It did not undo the loss that had defined most of her life, but it allowed her, slowly and carefully, to imagine a future that included something beyond simple survival and isolation. The investigation into his father's old advisors reached a critical point nearly 3 months after Alara's arrival at the palace, when Draven uncovered concrete evidence linking several senior court members to not just the original assault on the Voss pack, but to a broader pattern of manipulation and cruelty that had shaped much of his father's reign. The evidence was damning enough that Draven called for a formal council session to address the matter directly, a decision that sent ripples of tension through the entire palace. Alara attended the session at Draven's request, standing quietly at the edge of the council chamber as he laid out, in careful and precise detail, the evidence of his father's advisor's role in orchestrating violence against multiple packs over the years, including the assault that had destroyed her own family. She watched as men who had once held tremendous influence within the kingdom were formally stripped of their positions, their crimes finally acknowledged after 15 years of being buried beneath official reports and convenient silence. It was not the same as seeing her parents avenged in any traditional sense. The men most directly responsible for the fire that had taken everything from her, including Draven's own father, were long dead, beyond any justice she or Draven could deliver. But watching the machinery of manipulation and cruelty that had enabled such violence finally dismantled, watching Draven take genuine, difficult action to ensure such atrocities could never happen again under his rule, offered Alara something she had not expected to find in that palace. It offered a kind of closure, fragile and incomplete, but real nonetheless. After the council session ended, Draven found Alara waiting for him in a quiet corridor, away from the dispersing crowd, her expression unreadable, in a way that made him uncertain how she had received everything she had just witnessed. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice careful, uncertain whether the day's events had helped or harmed the fragile trust they had built together. Alara considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I do not know if I will ever feel entirely at peace with everything that happened to my family," she said finally. "But watching you today, watching you hold people accountable for the cruelty that shaped both our lives, it helps. It helps more than I expected it to." Draven felt something loosen in his chest at her words, a tension he had not fully acknowledged carrying since the day she had first confronted him about his father's old advisors. "I meant what I said, weeks ago," he told her. "I cannot undo what happened to you, but I can make certain the kingdom I build looks nothing like the one that made such cruelty possible." Alara studied him for a long moment, something soft and unguarded finally breaking through the careful walls she had maintained for so long. "I believe you," she said quietly, and the words carried a weight that went beyond simple agreement, a genuine, hard-won trust that had taken months of careful, patient effort to build. Their relationship shifted noticeably after that day, the remaining tension between them softening into something warmer, something that neither of them had expected to find, given the painful history connecting their two families. Alara began spending more time within the palace's main halls, no longer retreating immediately to the isolation of her private chamber or the quiet solitude of the gardens. She began, slowly, to let herself be seen by the wider court, no longer hiding from the whispers and curious glances that had once made her retreat into old, familiar patterns of caution. Draven, in turn, began involving her more directly in discussions about the future direction of his kingdom, valuing her perspective as someone who had experienced firsthand the consequences of the kind of unchecked cruelty his father had once wielded. Her insights, shaped by 15 years of survival and hard-won wisdom, offered him a perspective his palace-raised advisors could never fully provide. Neither of them spoke openly, during this period, about the deeper implications of the bond connecting them, both still cautious about moving too quickly, given everything that stood between their two families' histories. But the careful, growing warmth between them was impossible to ignore, evident in the way Draven's expression softened whenever Alara entered a room, in the way Alara found herself seeking out his company, even during moments when she might once have retreated into solitude instead. It would take several more months and several more difficult conversations before either of them was ready to fully acknowledge what had grown between them. But the foundation had been laid, built slowly and carefully from truth, accountability, and a willingness on both their parts to imagine a future shaped by something other than the violence and grief of their shared past. Winter settled over the Ashbourne kingdom nearly a year after Alara had first stepped out of the forest and into the strange, unfamiliar world of palace life. The cold season brought with it a kind of quiet reflection, snow blanketing the gardens she had come to love, the palace halls warmed by fires that reminded her, in unexpected ways, of the small shelters she had once built to survive the harshest months alone in the wilderness. She had changed considerably over the past year, though the fierce independence that had carried her through 15 years of isolation remained very much a part of who she was. She had learned to navigate the complicated social dynamics of court life, though she never fully abandoned her preference for honesty over diplomatic evasion, a trait that some courtiers found refreshing and others found unsettling. She had built genuine friendships among the palace staff, particularly with several of the Omegas Draven had personally overseen the rescue of during his ongoing efforts to dismantle the remaining corrupt practices from his father's era. Draven, too, had changed, though the shift in him was perhaps less visible on the surface and more evident in the quiet, steady confidence with which he now approached his responsibilities as king. The investigation into his father's old advisors had expanded, over the months, into a broader reform of how the kingdom handled territorial disputes and pack conflicts, informed heavily by conversations with Alara about the human cost of the kind of unchecked ambition that had shaped his father's reign. Their relationship, though never formally announced to the wider court, had become an open secret among those closest to them, evident in the easy familiarity with which they now spoke to each other, in the way Draven's schedule always seemed to leave room for time spent with her, in the way Alara had, almost without realizing it, stopped counting the days since she had last considered leaving the palace permanently. It was Alara herself who finally broached the subject neither of them had directly addressed since the early days of their careful, cautious courtship. They sat together one evening in a quiet study, a fire crackling in the hearth, the kind of comfortable silence between them that had become common over the past months. "I have been thinking about the bond," she said finally, her voice careful but steady, "about what it means, and what I want it to mean going forward." Draven turned to face her fully, his expression attentive and slightly uncertain, aware that this conversation carried weight beyond its simple words. "What have you decided?" he asked. Alara took a moment before answering, gathering thoughts she had been turning over in her mind for weeks. "For 15 years, I hated the very idea of anyone connected to your crest," she said. "I built my entire identity around survival and isolation, around a promise I made to my mother to live no matter what it cost me. I never imagined that living, truly living, might eventually mean choosing to stand beside the person I once considered my greatest enemy." "And now?" Draven asked, his voice quiet, careful not to push her toward any particular answer. "Now I understand that you were not the one who lit that fire," Alara said. "You were a frightened boy, manipulated by a father whose ambition mattered more to him than his own son's understanding of right and wrong. I have watched you spend the past year trying to build something better from the wreckage he left behind. I have watched you take real, difficult action to make certain no other family suffers the way mine did. That matters to me. It matters more than I expected it to." Draven reached for her hand, a gesture that had become natural between them over the past months, though it still carried a weight of significance neither of them took lightly. "I cannot promise you a life free of difficulty," he said. "The history between our families will always be part of our story, whether we acknowledge it openly or not. But I can promise you that I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the trust you have chosen to give me, worthy of the bond that connected us that day in the forest." Alara studied his face for a long moment, searching for any trace of doubt or hesitation, and finding none. "I do not need promises of an easy life," she said finally. "I have survived difficult things before. What I need is honesty and partnership, and the freedom to remain exactly who I am, wild and stubborn, and shaped by the forest that raised me after my family was taken." "You will always have that freedom," Draven said. "I would not want you any other way." The formal announcement of their bond, when it finally came several weeks later, sent ripples of surprise and speculation through the wider kingdom, though those closest to the couple had long anticipated the news. The ceremony itself was simple by royal standards, held not in the grand formal hall typically reserved for such occasions, but in the palace gardens Alara had come to love, surrounded by close friends, and the small circle of people who had witnessed the slow, careful building of trust between them over the past year. Ilara insisted on one particular addition to the ceremony that surprised many of the court observers: a formal acknowledgement, spoken aloud by Draven himself before the assembled witnesses, of the history between their two families and the ongoing commitment he had made to ensure such violence never again shaped the kingdom's approach to territorial disputes. It was not a typical element of a royal bonding ceremony, but for Ilara, it represented something essential: a public recognition that her past, however painful, remained an inseparable part of the future she was choosing to build. As the ceremony concluded and the small gathering of witnesses offered their congratulations, Ilara found herself thinking not of the fire that had taken her family 15 years earlier, nor of the 15 years of isolation and survival that had followed, but of her mother's final words, spoken in the chaos of that terrible night. Live, no matter what it costs. She had kept that promise, through years of hardship and solitude, through careful survival in a forest that had become both her prison and her sanctuary. And now, standing beside the man fate had chosen for her, a man who had proven himself worthy, not through empty words, but through difficult, sustained action, she understood that living, truly living, meant more than simple survival. It meant building something new from the wreckage of the past, choosing connection over isolation, choosing hope over the comfortable familiarity of old grief. The path ahead would not be simple. Rebuilding trust between the remaining Voss allies scattered across the kingdom and the Ashbourne crown would take years of careful, patient work. But for the first time since that terrible night 15 years earlier, Ilara felt something she had almost forgotten how to recognize. She felt hope, steady and real, for a future that no longer belonged only to grief and survival, but to partnership, purpose, and the quiet, hard-won peace of a promise, finally, fully kept. Spring arrived early in the year following Ilara and Draven's formal bonding, the palace gardens bursting into color after the long winter months, and with it came a new chapter neither of them could have fully anticipated during the difficult, careful months of building trust between them. Ilara had begun, with Draven's full support, a project close to her heart, one that drew directly from her own hard experience of survival and loss. She established, on a quiet stretch of land near the old Voss territory, a sanctuary for survivors of pack conflicts across the kingdom, a place where those who had lost everything to violence and displacement could find safety, community, and the kind of practical support Ilara herself had never received during her own 15 years of isolated survival. She oversaw much of the project personally, drawing on her intimate knowledge of the forest surrounding the sanctuary, teaching survival skills to those who needed them, and offering a listening ear to those still processing grief she understood more deeply than most. Draven supported the project not just through royal funding, but through genuine, sustained policy reform aimed at preventing the kind of territorial violence that had shaped both their families' histories. He worked closely with pack leaders across the kingdom, establishing new frameworks for resolving disputes that did not rely on the brutal, unchecked force his father had once wielded so carelessly. It was slow, difficult work, met with resistance from some corners of the court, still nostalgic for the old ways, but Draven pursued it with the same steady determination that had first drawn Ilara's cautious trust during their early conversations in the forest. The old Voss territory itself underwent a transformation over the following months, the scorched, overgrown ruins of Ilara's childhood village slowly giving way to something new. Rather than clearing the land for a military outpost, as the original survey party had once planned, Draven redirected the project entirely, working with Ilara to design a memorial garden at the heart of the old village site, a place where the names of those lost in the massacre were finally, formally honored after 15 years of silence. Ilara stood at the center of that memorial garden on the day of its completion, reading the names carved into a simple stone monument, names she had carried alone in her memory for so many years, finally given permanent, public acknowledgement. Her parents' names sat at the top of the list, alongside every other member of the Voss pack who had perished that night. She traced her fingers over the carved letters, feeling a complicated mixture of grief and peace settle over her chest. Draven stood beside her, quiet and respectful of the moment, understanding, without needing to be told, that this place carried a weight for Ilara that went beyond simple ceremony. "I wish I could have known them," he said softly, gesturing toward her parents' names. "From everything you have told me, they raised someone remarkable." Ilara felt tears gather in her eyes, though they no longer carried the same sharp, unbearable grief that had once defined every memory of her parents. "They would have been proud of what we have built here," she said. "Not just this garden, but everything beyond it. The sanctuary, the reforms, the chance for other families to avoid what happened to mine." Over the following years, the sanctuary Ilara had established grew into one of the most respected institutions in the kingdom, drawing survivors from across various territories who had heard of the safety and support it offered. Ilara herself became something of a legend in her own right, no longer whispered about as a ghost haunting the forest, but spoken of openly and with genuine respect as the Luna who had transformed personal tragedy into lasting protection for others facing similar loss. She never fully lost the wildness that 15 years in the forest had instilled in her. She continued to disappear into the deep woods for days at a time, particularly during difficult anniversaries or moments when the weight of her responsibilities as Luna grew too heavy, always returning with the same quiet, grounded clarity that the forest had given her since childhood. Draven never questioned these retreats, understanding that the forest remained, in its own complicated way, as essential to who Ilara was, as the palace and the kingdom had become. Their partnership deepened over the years into something that went beyond the initial, undeniable pull of their bond, growing into a genuine, hard-won love built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and an unflinching commitment to honesty, even when the truth was difficult. Draven continued his work dismantling the remaining structures of cruelty his father had built, while Ilara continued expanding the reach and impact of the sanctuary that had become her life's true purpose. 5 years after the fire that had once seemed destined to define the rest of her life through grief and isolation, Ilara stood once more in the memorial garden at the heart of the old Voss territory, this time surrounded not by silence and loss, but by the sounds of a thriving community that had grown up around the sanctuary she had built. Children who had once fled violence in their own territories now played among the trees she had spent 15 years hiding within, their laughter filling the same forest that had once been her only refuge from a world that had taken everything from her. She thought often, during these moments, of the promise she had made to her mother on the worst night of her life. Live, no matter what it costs. She understood now, in a way she could not have grasped, as a frightened 10-year-old girl hiding beneath a fallen tree, that living fully meant more than simple survival. It meant choosing, again and again, to build something meaningful from even the deepest loss. It meant finding the courage to trust again, to love again, to believe that the future could hold something other than the pain of the past. The forest that had hidden her for 15 years remained, in many ways, the truest home she had ever known, shaping her into someone strong enough to survive unimaginable loss, and wise enough to transform that survival into lasting purpose. And standing beside the man fate had chosen for her, a man who had proven through years of consistent, difficult action that he was worthy of the trust she had once believed impossible to give, Ilara finally understood that her story had never truly been about the fire that destroyed her family. It had always been about what she chose to build from the ashes, and the unexpected, hard-won peace of finding love in the very place she had once believed only pain could exist.